Welcome to Filmmaking for Noobs. My name is Kyle Lawrence, and this is a brand new series that I'm starting with new episodes being released every other Saturday. Now, this first episode, we're going to dive into a DSLR beginner's guide. We're going to cover some camera basics so that you can have a better understanding of how to use your camera. Today I'm using a DSLR as our example. However, what we're talking about today will apply to just about any camera. DSLRs, mirrorless, high-end cinema cameras, even some point-and-shoot cameras. Now the controls and where you find these settings may differ from camera to camera, but the concepts and how to use the camera is going to remain about the same. For most of my examples today, I'll be using the Canon 5D Mark II. And the first thing we're going to look at today is lenses. You have two basic types of lenses to choose from. The first is called a prime lens. The second is called a zoom lens. In front of me, I have four lenses. Three of them are prime lenses. One of them is a zoom lens. A prime lens is a lens that has a fixed focal length. A zoom lens is a lens that has a range of focal lengths. For example, this is a 50mm prime lens. This is a 15mm prime lens, also known as a fisheye lens. This is a 24mm prime lens, and this is a 70-300 zoom lens. These three lenses do not have a zoom ring. With my 15mm prime lens, this is the only focal length I have. I cannot zoom in or zoom out. Now, when it comes to choosing lenses, whether a prime lens or a zoom lens, there are two commonly used measurements. Your first measurement is your focal length. Your second measurement is your focal factor. With focal length, which is measured in millimeters, the lower the number of the focal length of your lens, the wider your lens is. This 15mm lens produces a fisheye effect. It is so wide. Then a pretty typical wide lens would be this 24mm lens, the 50mm lens, which is actually a pretty tight shot, and then the 70mm to 300mm lens, which 300mm would be very telephoto. To give you a good idea of focal length, I have two cameras set up right now. Both of them are roughly the same distance from me. Right now, you're seeing me through a 50mm lens, and the camera is about 2.5 feet away from me. I have another camera set up right next to it using a 15mm lens. That camera is maybe an inch farther from me, very similar distances between the subject and the camera, and yet the lens at 15mm is seeing much more than the lens at 50. You can see that the 50mm lens from about 2.5 feet away is a pretty tight close-up shot, whereas the 15mm lens, since it's a fisheye lens, regardless of the distance, is going to be a very wide shot. The second measurement commonly used in lenses is your focal factor. Now, your focal factor tells you how large your aperture is, which is the opening that's letting in the light. The larger the opening letting in light, the more light that's going to come in. The smaller the opening, the less light that's going to come in. A larger aperture will give you a better picture in low light condition. The focal factor tells you the exact size of the aperture of your lens by taking the focal length of your lens and dividing it by the focal factor. For example, this lens right here is a 50mm f1.8 lens. That means that the largest the aperture of this lens can go is 50mm divided by 1.8. Hey Siri, what is 50 divided by 1.8?
Divided by 1.8 is about 27.7777.
Which is 27.777 millimeters. Now this zoom lens, because it's a cheaper zoom lens, it has a focal factor range. It's called a 70 to 300 millimeter f4 to 5.6 zoom lens. At the widest focal length, which in this case is 70 millimeters, the aperture is 70 divided by 4. Or the focal factor of 4. However, at the tightest focal length on this lens, which is 300 millimeters, your focal factor is only 5.6, which means that your aperture at 300 mils is 300 divided by 5.6. Most of the higher quality, nicer, and more expensive zoom lenses have a consistent focal factor throughout the entire zoom range. Now, depending on the camera and the lens, there are different ways to adjust your aperture. For example, this is a completely manual lens, so it has an aperture ring built in. Most lenses that you buy are probably not going to have an aperture ring and are probably going to be controlled somewhere in the camera. For example, on the 5D Mark II, you have to go into this little menu to adjust the aperture, which I find kind of annoying. With the 5D Mark III, while in video mode, you can adjust the aperture much easier using the wheel. On other cameras, your aperture setting may be in a different place, and on a Nikon, I have absolutely no idea where that setting would be. Your aperture, or your focal factor, is often referred to as f-stop. So the lower your f-stop, the larger your aperture. The higher your focal factor, or f-stop, the smaller your aperture. So an f1.4 lens is going to give you much better low light results than an f2.8 lens. Setting your aperture to a lower focal factor, which increases the size of your aperture, will also give you a much shallower depth of field. Increasing your focal factor to a higher number is going to give you a much deeper depth of field. If you're having trouble keeping your subject in focus, you can try stopping down your aperture 1 or 2 stops to give you a bit more depth to allow for crisper, sharper images of your subject. There are 2 other settings in your camera that will give you greater control over the exposure of your image, because sometimes you'll want to choose an aperture based on how deep or shallow you want your depth of field to be. The second setting that we'll look at is your shutter speed or your shutter angle. Now those are 2 completely different things, but they're referring to the same element of the camera. And in most DSLRs or mirrorless or prosumer and consumer cameras, it's usually going to be referred to as your shutter speed. Some cameras refer to it as exposure or exposure length or exposure time, but we'll call it shutter speed for now. Shutter speed is referring to the amount of time that your shutter is allowing your sensor to be exposed. Your shutter speed is notated as a fraction, 1 over and then a number. This fraction is telling us for what duration of 1 second that light is hitting the sensor for every image or photograph or frame. The longer duration your shutter speed is, the more motion blur you may have on moving subjects. However, if you're shooting video, you're going to want to adjust your shutter speed relative to your frame rate. Typically, I would recommend shooting your video at 24 frames per second or 23.976 frames per second. Regardless of your frame rate, you will typically want to set your shutter speed to be twice your frame rate. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, your shutter speed should be 1 over 48th of a second. On the Canon 5D Mark II, I don't have a 1 over 48 option. I have a 1 over 40 and a 1 over 50. 50 is closer to 48 than 40. I usually shoot my video at 1 over 50 or 1/50th of a second. Now, if you want to make your shot look much more action-like with that, raw Saving Private Ryan looking motion, then you would typically want to double your shutter speed. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, instead of using a shutter speed of 1 over 48, try a shutter speed of 1 over 96. Even though you'll want to keep your shutter speed within a certain range when shooting video, when it comes to shooting photos, you have a lot more freedom when it comes to shutter speed, and you can use your shutter speed to compensate for exposure. Using a slower shutter speed or exposing your image for a longer duration of time will allow more light to penetrate your sensor and give you better results in low light conditions. However, a slower shutter speed or a longer duration exposure is going to give you a lot more blur when it comes to moving subjects. If you're shooting something that's really fast paced, you'll want to use a much faster shutter speed, which does require more light and exposes the sensor for a shorter period of time, but it helps to make your images sharper and crisper with less motion blur. However, sometimes using a slower shutter speed or a longer exposure in order to capture moving water or other similar things can give your image a really cool effect. The next setting we're going to look at is your color temperature, or your white balance. Some cameras refer to this as color temperature, some cameras refer to this as white balance. White balance means you're telling your camera what white is, or you're balancing your camera to make sure that the whites look white. If your color temperature is set too warm, then your whites are not going to look white, they're going to look orange or warm. If your color temperature is set too cool, then your whites are not going to look white, they're going to look blue or cool. I won't go too in depth today on color temperature, but you'll want to make sure that you adjust your color temperature settings to match the lighting of your scene. The color temperature of daylight or sunlight is usually somewhere between 5600 degrees Kelvin and 6500 degrees Kelvin. If you're shooting outdoors in daylight, setting your color temperature to something around that range is going to give you the best results. As the sun starts to set, you'll probably want to bump your color temperature up a bit warmer to keep that natural daylight look. However, if you're shooting indoors under tungsten lighting or incandescent, you'll usually want to set your color temperature somewhere in the range of 2800 to 3600 degrees Kelvin, and then adjust it based on what looks best. When shooting video on your DSLR, you should definitely adjust your color temperature exactly how you want it to be in the end result. Obviously, you do have some control to color correct later on, but that color temperature setting that you set your camera to is for the most part going to be baked in to your file. With photographs, you have a bit more control over your color temperature later on if you're shooting in RAW format. The next setting I'm going to talk about is your ISO setting. But the ISO setting is basically your image sensitivity. The higher your ISO, the more sensitive to light your sensor is going to be. But the higher your ISO, the more susceptible to grain and noise your sensor is going to be. So if you're shooting in low light conditions, you'll probably need to bump up your ISO to a higher number in order to see more detail. If you bump your ISO up too high, you're gonna start to notice a lot of noise, and usually that's not good. Now in the DSLR world, we like to just adjust our ISO based on what looks best. And if we need our image to be brighter or darker, we usually adjust our ISO either higher or lower to compensate for the exposure. In the professional film world, the ISO will usually stay consistent throughout the entire shoot. Maybe sometimes bumping it up or down for certain circumstances, and so when you have your aperture set to where you want it to get the right depth of field, and you have your shutter speed fixed relative to your frame rate to get the best looking motion, and you have your ISO fixed at a certain setting, that means that it takes a lot more skill and time to properly light your shot and using filters in order to compensate for exposure. However, in the basic DSLR world, it's really easy for us to just use our ISO setting up or down. Now there's just two more things I'm gonna look at in this episode. The first is taking care of your camera, your lens, and protecting your sensor. When changing your lens, you want to have your sensor of your camera protected at all times. Your lens has two faces to it, the front and the back. You don't want to touch those. You don't want fingerprints on them, and you want to keep them clear of dirt. I would highly recommend using a fine microfiber cloth to wipe off any smudges and keep your lenses clean. You'll want to keep your camera sensor protected at all times. You should never transport or carry around your camera without a lens or a cover on it. Otherwise, dirt may get into the camera, into the sensor, and cause problems with your images. Now in a DSLR or a digital single lens reflex camera, when you take off your lens, the first thing you'll see is a mirror, which is actually taking the image from your lens and redirecting it up to your viewfinder. Anytime you take an exposure or while in video mode, the mirror will flip up and allow your sensor to be exposed. Your sensor is a very, very important and delicate part of your camera, and you don't want to touch it. You don't want to allow dirt or dust or anything else to get into your camera and come in contact with your sensor. Now on a mirrorless camera, you don't have the mirror, hence why it's called mirrorless. You definitely want to keep your lens covers on your lenses as well, because that would prolong the life of your lens. The thing we're going to look at today in this episode of Filmmaking for Noobs is the settings that you have your camera set to for recording images and video. Most DSLR cameras will allow you to shoot photos in two different formats, JPEGs and RAW. Many of them have different levels of compression for your JPEGs, as well as different levels of compression for your RAW images. I highly recommend shooting in both JPEG and RAW simultaneously and setting both your JPEG and your RAW to the highest quality, lowest compression that's available. This is going to take up much more space on your memory card and your hard drive, but it's going to give you a much higher quality image. The reason I shoot with both is because the RAW image allows me to fine-tune my image and really make it look great after I shoot it. It allows me to have full control over color temperature and much more control over my exposure, my highlights, my shadows, and everything else in between to make the image look really good. My JPEGs are already compressed and don't have that same control. The JPEG images offer me a really easy and quick way to quickly preview my images and see the pictures that I took. As far as shooting video mode on a DSLR camera, you also usually have a few options. Most cameras will give you a few different resolution options as well as frame rates and compression options. I would highly recommend always choosing the highest resolution and lowest compression possible. This is going to give you the highest quality and best looking image that you can. You can always downsize or downres your image later, that's not a problem. But if you try to upres your image later, you're going to have less quality and a lot of pixelation. I hope that all this information has helped you to better understand how to use your DSLR or whatever other camera you may have. This has been Filmmaking for Noobs. I'm Kyle Lawrence. New episodes every other Saturday on my channel. Check it out below. Thanks for watching. Thank you for watching Filmmaking for Noobs. If you liked what you saw, then please let me know by clicking that little like button. If you'd like to see more, then please subscribe to my channel by clicking my face right there. You can check out other videos here and here, Or if there's anything else that you'd like me to cover in a future episode, then please leave a comment below. Until next time, keep it rolling.